Hello and welcome everyone.
Everyone.
My name is Sarah Corpy and I will be the host and moderator for this ADEIL conference session. Thank you for joining us for inclusive practices in the virtual learning space. Please welcome Teresa Leary-Jenkins and Tamika Fitzpatrick.
Hi.
Hi everyone, welcome. I am Teresa Leary-Jenkins and I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Mary's Episcopal School in Memphis, Tennessee, as well as I'm an Associate Faculty Member at Ashford University. Happy to be here with you all today.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Tamika Fitzpatrick. I'm the Program Chair of the Masters of Arts in Early Childhood Education Leadership here at Ashford University, and we are looking forward today to talking to you about some of the inclusive practices that we've been integrating in our classrooms, both online and on ground. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions, so jot those down if you have any.
So let's first look at this quote. We must teach the way students learn rather than expecting them to learn the way we teach. And that's from the renowned researcher, Dr. Pedro Noguera. And I want you all to take a moment to think about the way that you all feel when you read this quote. I want you to think about the students that are in your classroom today, the older students, the students who have a high tech footprint. And I want you to think about the way you felt when you were being taught and the way you felt and the way you were instructed to teach. And so I want us to think about and reflect on how we now must be a little bit more adaptable. And I want to do as I'm a former social worker too, as well as an educator, but we always, in social work, you start where the client is. And so I want us to think about how we can start where our students are. And I really think this quote really does help to center us. And so just take a few moments and maybe jot down for reflection what this means to you and how your experience in the classroom, either learning or as teaching, how this quote can resonate with you. Uh-oh. Who's that? I'm not sure whose screen is that. Is this my screen or your screen?
Yours.
Okay. So we've been having some Okay, so now we're going to move into understandings.
So one of the things we like to do when we're talking about inclusive practices is to be sure that when we say inclusive, we mean inclusive across the gamut. Some of the things that we're going to talk about may include your definition of inclusivity, but remember, we're talking the gamut of diversity, which is going to include things like, inclusive of gender, inclusive of race, inclusive of ethnicity. And a lot of times when you get into topics like this, people become apprehensive because there may be a particular issue that you're advocating the strongest for, and we're talking about diversity as a whole. So when we're having these conversations, we really want to be sure that we're reminding you, we want to try to agree to avoid conversation halting terms. And when you hear that word, it's often like, what do you mean by conversation halting terms? We don't want to assign labels to other people. That's the nicest way for me to say that. So we don't want to say, you responded this way, so you are this. We aren't going to assign labels to other people. We really want to be sure that everyone understands that when we're talking about inclusive practices, it is very hard to think that you're going to get everything that you need in one setting, one training, or one day. This type of really including inclusive practices, it's a continuous improvement plan. It's a continuous improvement effort. We want to agree to disagree respectfully. So one of the things we're going to talk about is going to be civil discourse, and we'll go through some steps on what that looks like. If you were in the sessions earlier today, particularly the keynote, you may have heard Dr. Swenson mention that people are often often, they don't want to hear that you're not the expert. So Dr. Jenkins and I like to say, we are doctors, but we cannot write you a prescription when it comes to inclusive practices. There is no prescription. We cannot give you a solution. Our aim is to be descriptive. We want you to understand that your inclusive practices are going to be based on the needs of the individuals that are comprising your learning environment. So Dr. Swenson made a funny quote today, and I like to say, we can tell you where to look. We cannot tell you what to see. So remember, we are not trying to solve all of the problems, but we're here to give suggestions. We also want to try to avoid stereotypes. Remember, when we're thinking about how we're making assumptions about a group of people, a stereotype is a negative statement about a group of people. It can be positive or negative, but what it does is it places those people in a box with a limit and a very specific perspective. If we are going to have generalizations, let's be sure that they are valid versus faulty. And then we're going to use things like I statements. So instead of me trying to speak for an entire group, I'm going to say I, so that we're sure that you're understanding that we cannot solve your problems. We cannot answer for everybody, but we're going to use I statements, and those understandings really will be used to kind of guide our work.
All right, so our path for today is really to understand some common words. We're going to talk about diversity, culture, equity, inclusion, and we're going to deal with blind spots, which we all have. And we're going to give you some options for read, writing, and listening. So different ways that you can grow in this area, and we'll give you some next steps. So let's talk about diversity. Dr. Fitzpatrick, I'm going to let you advance the slide.
Is it not? Okay.
So diversity is understanding that each individual is unique, and we recognize individual differences. And we know that diversity has many different facets: diversity of thought, religion, ability, gender, age, and sexuality, language. It's really important that we understand that all of that shows up in our classrooms: socioeconomic differences, educational differences, and our backgrounds. The role that our backgrounds have in our practice cannot be underestimated. So we're going to talk about culture. So culture is understood as being that shared, dynamic, systemic, and symbolic. It's known, that is kind of really what makes us who we are. When we think about how we communicate and the things that we value, the things that we believe, what our lived experiences are, that's really our learned behaviors. That's what our culture is. And I think you all have probably heard of this word, cultural competency. So the only way that you can develop and improve your cultural competency is by really understanding who you are, defining who you are, understanding who you are relative to other people. And that means that you have to explore how you came to be the person that you are. That includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. For example, it's not enough to just ignore the fact that the parent who rambled at your dining room table at the holidays with racist rhetoric, that was just an event that happened. You have to really explore how that may have impacted your development as a person. And you have to acknowledge that within your background, some of the mores and folkways that have been a part of your experience impacted your socialization. And even though you may not necessarily ascribe to those beliefs, that is something that you were exposed to, and that you may have to do some work in unpacking that personally. So now let's look at what we consider equity. So equity is the quality of being fair, and it's impartial, and it's ensuring that students have what they need specifically to be successful. So I'm not going to show you that graphic that we all have seen of the students at the fence. I'm sure if you have been in any conversations over the last few months, you've seen the 3 children at a fence, and they show different variations of that about what is equity and what is equitable. Instead, I want you to imagine helping your students who are in front of you. For example, I had a student in class recently, and he did not have his textbook. And so one of the things that I explored is, yes, there was an issue with the bookstore, And yes, he didn't actually tell me this, but I heard that some of the students were struggling in that area. And so I decided to screen shoot the passages that they were expected to write a reflection on and just post them in the chat and to email them out to the class. And he sent me a thank you note. And I then started involving other students in the process, saying, hey, why don't you all screen shoot what we're talking about, the chart, because I know some of the students didn't have that resource. So when you have students that you know are struggling, it's not enough to just let them struggle or to ask them to solve that problem. It's really important that you help facilitate that problem, help facilitate a solution to that problem. Another instance that I can think of is when a student was working in the service industry, and she sent me a text at 10 o'clock at night and in a panic almost. And I could tell that she had been thinking about her assignment on her job, and that she, it was 10 o'clock at night and she was really upset. And I said, call me. So she called me on her break and I walked her through the assignment. And then I sent her a quick text with some words that she could remember. That student turned in a fantastic assignment because I helped her figure out how she could solve that problem, and I helped her be successful. And so those are the boxes and those are the ramps that I am talking about, helping our students get what they need to be successful. Finally, I want to talk about inclusion. And inclusion is the sense of belonging, feeling valued and seen for who we are as individuals. So people describe inclusion as not only being asked to the party, but being asked to dance to music that you may like. Or it's not only just being invited to dinner, but it's being invited to dinner and breaking bread with food that you may actually want to eat. And it's being seen and embraced. All students need to feel this. I've noticed that even my white male students need that space too. This is an awkward time for many people in our society, and we have to give everyone space and place. So when there's inclusion, there's this level of supportive energy and a commitment for all stakeholders. And that allows everyone to be the best they can be, and it allows them to work together and be successful, as well as working collectively and being successful. So when you look at what's in our classroom, really we're seeing blind spots. And so some of those blind spots are because we are comfortable with what we're doing. So we've had this, we've gotten our common language under our belts. And so I want you to continue to be reflective, and because we know that being reflective is key to kind of getting over these larger rocks that we need to be successful as educators. So when we're dealing with blind spots in the classroom, you have to know yourself. You have to know who you are. You have to know what your capacity is. And this is what we mean when you hear folks talk about being culturally competent, which I just spoke to you about a few minutes ago. You have to know your culture. You have to know what you bring to the discussion. And then you also have to be willing to understand and support the cultures of those in your classroom. So this understanding informs and expands our teaching practices in this culturally competent educators classroom. So that means knowing your religious holidays, paying attention to emails regarding accommodations, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Getting to know your students as people and not insisting that cameras be on in class. I was on Twitter earlier this morning, and there was a debate around students having hoods on in the K-12 classroom. And it was this interesting argument around control and decorum. And it was just this very interesting dialogue. So we have to understand what, as somebody said, what hill are you willing to die on as an educator? So
it feels like so long since
I know it does. It really does.
If you could, please.
I just realized I don't have my earrings on.
So also exploring your unconscious bias, and we're going to give you some resources for that. So what happens if we're not culturally responsive in our work, if we don't have this awareness of cultural differences, and if we don't understand what our blind spots are? There's a great book called Blind Spots. It's a New York Times bestselling book that you may want to buy and explore. But the questions that I've raised above, those are questions that you can ask yourself. And you can ask yourself whether or not you are scheduling things around religious holidays like Ramadan when people are fasting. And then you can explore whether or not you're truly being inclusive. And so helping yourself, helping to explore and research about your students and understanding their backgrounds will help eliminate some of those blind spots in the classroom. So I mentioned to you all about the emails regarding accommodations. So there are some online tests that we can take. The implicit association test, you all may have heard of these. These are found either through the website that's on the slide in front of you, but also Teaching Tolerance has some resources available. But these professors at Harvard and University of Washington and University of Virginia created this project Implicit to develop these hidden bias tests. And they are called the implicit association test. And there are a variety of them for race, gender, career, age, Arab, Muslim, transgender, etc. So these hidden bias tests measure our unconscious and our automatic biases. And I will tell you that I recently had a number of accommodations in my class, and I felt myself becoming a little, as I was reflecting on beginning this class, I felt that I needed to do some work on my reaction to having so many students with an accommodation request. So I did the disability implicit association test, and I'm happy to say that I had some blind spots that I needed to work on. And I'm glad that I did that reflective work. And I would encourage you to do that type of reflective work before you start classes that may have those types of numbers where you have when you notice that internal reaction, it's a good time for you to maybe check in with yourself and do some reflective work. And I think that is a way that we can reframe our online environment.
Thank you, Dr. Leary. So one of the things that we like to talk about is when we think of inclusive practices, for so many of us, we think about what those inclusive practices tend to look like in our brick and mortar rooms. And a lot of times, one of the things that we do is something that was mentioned earlier by Dr. Swenson. The intellectual process is emotional, and a bruised learner is cognitively impaired. So when we think of the need to promote inclusivity in these classrooms, I want you to first look at the paragraph or the part of that column that talks about what things look like in-person classes. So when you're brick and mortar, the primary concern in person is usually targeted towards task completion and attendance. The gains in energy are also there. The building trust, you're building trust with your students through the tasks that they are completing, the work that they are doing. And then as an instructor, you feel a sense of accomplishment through that task completion. So it's kind of a checklist. You're able to check off those things that are going on and creating this classroom culture. When you're online though, so much of that criteria is based on the relationships that you are having. And some people, the automatic question is, how do you build relationships with people when you are not face-to-face? How do you build relationships when your students actually have the options of either logging in or not logging in? And so we like to provide just a few specifics. When we talk about building those student relationships, it's really going to be important that you start with a self-reflection. And so if you think about what Dr. Leary just mentioned, that may begin with discovering where you may have some areas of opportunity. Whenever we are recommending taking the implicit bias assessments, that is something where we're not asking you to share that information with other people. But as Dr. Leary said, sometimes we've taken those ourselves and we've realized that there may be things that are unintentionally coming out in our communications with our students. And so we want to start with a self-reflection. We can do that, number one, by listening. Listening to what our students are telling us. You'll hear some really great stories about people who their students are telling them that they feel that there is a bias that they aren't necessarily aware of. We can build relationships with them. You've heard some great examples in other sessions earlier today too, where we talk about, how do you build relationships? You let them know that you are there for them academically, but you tie in things that have to do with them personally. So if you know a student just had a baby or there's a life-changing event, that you are acknowledging those things. We encourage in that self-reflection for you to expand your current knowledge. And sometimes this is going to extend extend beyond what we automatically go to of our textbook knowledge, and it requires that we're actually getting the knowledge, the information that we need from a primary source. And in this case, our primary source is going to be the students that we are working with. And then seek authentic connections. This, when we think about authentic connections, again, this can be a little cumbersome when you're talking about working in an online environment, but if you want to have an inclusive classroom, it is going to be a very necessary component. Be curious. Ask your students questions about themselves. Ask them the types of things that they need. So if we go back to the idea that you can have a classroom where people can have accommodations, even though you're getting that regulation or you're getting the paper that is telling you what it is they need, you may also want to inquire about what is it they would like, and then model and promote civil discourse. And that's something that we're going to talk about in just a little bit more, but Dr. Jenkins is going to give you some more information about some instructional strategies as well. You're muted.
I always tell people that's going to be the best-selling t-shirt, "You're muted," if you want a retirement plan. So when you're thinking about instructional strategies, it's really important to think about what your students need in the classroom. So that can look as simple as suggesting using Google Translate. I know for myself, even pronouncing names can be a challenge. And so in the K-12 arena, which is where I'm from, we are actually having a team of linguistic professors are going to come out to our high school and work with our teachers around how can you learn to pronounce a name that you're unfamiliar with by giving them some instruction around roots of different names in different languages. And so that was it was a very interesting solution to a very difficult problem that does impact the self-esteem of students. So, and I don't know if we had a little blunder at the beginning, but you may have seen how I actually phonetically written out the last name of Pedro Noguera, because when you're nervous and when you're feeling a little anxious, you can very easily forget how to pronounce something. So I write things out for myself, and I encourage my students to do the same thing when they're presenting in class and things like that. So the other, you'll notice that I have memes on here, and I have there's a meme generator. And so you see, what is the student's accommodation needed on the IEP? I'll wait. And so that's a great way to just kind of have a little bit of fun and give them a visual of what a question is that you're asking in class. And so think about your multi-language learners and using those things like Google Translate, and then also using those tools that are interactive, like the Ask Your Professor, and try to deliver those messages and those lessons in a variety of ways so that you're doing auditory and written and video, and giving students instructions through that video. And using Flipgrids and emojis, Padlets, polls, and even giving students the option of pre-recording their responses so that there isn't that anxiety that can occur for some students. But the most important thing that you have to do is to be authentic and genuine in your response and in your interactions with your students, and to show them that you really do care and that you're trying to reach them wherever they are, which I think in this day and age is very important.
Thank you. So one of the ways you can also think about your instruction is when we talk about building those relationships with our students, we think of our priorities. And one of the things that we want to do, we mentioned promoting civil discourse. And so one of the things we want to do is avoid disagreeing with the position because you have a different personal experience. We want to embrace encouraging our students to share their experiences through active listening techniques. Why is it important to promote civil discourse? Because there is this power is not equal. We can't say as instructors that we are going to debate our students in a way that's going to feel like a debate to them. So we will assume that it's a debate, but because the power is not equal, it may come across to them as bullying. It could also then impact their desire to participate in discussions in the class. But it's going to be really important to note that this requires practice. And so if our goal is to be sure that we are exchanging knowledge and helping our students develop their arguments, it's going to be really important that they are seeing that we're there to help them develop that argument, even if it's something that we don't agree with. And there's lots of resources out there about civil discourse. We do actually encourage you to look into those. If that's something that you're feeling like you're having a problem with. But again, a lot of times our intent may be that it is, we're simply trying to teach them or enhance their knowledge, but their perception of that may be very different. So how do you do that? Number one is we say, respect your role. So as an instructor, if your goal is to share information, and you want them to be able to make informed decisions, remember that there is that professional capacity, and you want to ensure that they're sharing the interpretation of their information. Don't rush over disagreements, and that can be very uncomfortable because it's like you don't want to linger, but you also don't want the student to feel like if they bring something to your attention that you're simply dismissing it. We have to remember that disagreements are a normal part of our interactions. It's a little funny though when you're online because, you would think that it's pretty easy to avoid disagreements. It's also going to be very important that we don't import energy from other places. So our students may say something that is triggering for us, or we may say something that is triggering for our students. So we want to be sure that we are coming into the conversation or reading their responses based on this current situation. So if they read a passage and they interpret it different than you, we don't then want to attach a meaning to it without getting clarification. And then we really want to be teaching with the idea of a win-win. And if we're engaging in conversations with our students, we can operate as Covey says, in a win-win. That means our students are able to win and we're able to win. We don't have to look at it as in order for me to win, my student has to be losing, particularly when we're talking about engaging in civil discourse with our students. There shouldn't be a time in our classroom where we're feeling that this is I've got to win and they have to lose, okay? And then this is something that my colleagues have heard me say before, practice unconditional acceptance. This is a tough one because one of the things that we want to do is to be sure that our students feel safe to be who they actually are and to say what they honestly think without fear of facing ridicule, hostility, or harsh and negative judgment. And if you're a parent, you know that can be a difficult one. Sometimes we say things to our children and the assumption of unconditional, acceptance is not always clear. So we want to be sure that even though we are separated geographically and the only communication we may have with our students is through writing, we want to be sure that we are conveying to them that they are unconditionally accepted in the learning environment. And then let's say you participate in the self-reflective process and you honestly can say, I don't think I'm creating an inclusive environment. It's really important to note that much like we all do, you have an opportunity. So a lot of times people will say, I'm not doing that. It's hard. I don't know how. I'm going to sit that to the side until I can master it, and I'm going to go on and do something else. This is an opportunity for all of us to learn and to grow. And so it begins by asking the right questions. And when we talk about asking the right questions, it can be extremely hard for some of us who've been doing things for a really long time and we feel like we're experts at it to then say, how can I improve? But just as we tell our students that learning is a lifelong process, it's a lifelong process for us as well. So we want to look at who are our primary sources of information. And when we're talking inclusive online learning environments, I cannot reiterate enough that the primary source of information is going to be the students themselves. We want to be sure as we're looking at creating an inclusive environment, are all voices being represented? And I want to give just a quick little suggestion here. We keep referring back to students who have accommodations in the classroom, and we understand that sometimes that gives them an extended time to participate in the discussion. That also means that a lot of times those discussions are posted when most of the students are already moving on with the learning. And so one of the things that we can do is circle back and encourage them to read a response from someone who may have posted a little bit earlier. But you also want to be sure, maybe as you're posting your announcements or you're responding in graded feedback, we want to know, are we creating an environment of otherness? And if so, that gives us a great opportunity to improve. So we want to understand the dynamic. We want to be sure that we are using multiple perspectives, and we also want to be sure that we are making strategic decisions.
So how do we close the equity gaps? We've just heard from Dr. Fitzpatrick how you really want to make sure that you don't have anyone othered. And one of the ways that you can do that is with supplemental lessons that actually accommodate for the absence of that diverse lens. So provide some pre-recorded context lessons that support that learning. And you can use these resources to help your students explore their unconscious bias, understanding of racism, and any institutional and systemic racism that may be present. Another tool is the Racial Equity Tools, which is found at racialequitytools.org. And so this is a website that has lots of resources that are designed to support individuals and groups who are working to achieve racial equity. So there's a great way to use those tools and resources, tips, and they also have curricula on the site. Smithsonian Talking About Race series. So encourage your students to look at tolerance.org. You can use tolerance.org, which has lots of lessons and resources and assessments. And then how do you expose your students who may be unfamiliar with certain subject matter? One of those ways in the day of COVID is to do virtual field trips, provide hot topic discussions and quotes of the day. The most important thing, though, is to avoid binary thinking by having and encouraging diversity of thought. And so assigning solution-based program projects in your classroom, which encourages students to use their own voice and to choose how they are going to present that material. I can think of a class that I'm teaching at a community college where the students were encouraged to use their own voice. So that could mean they could include a TikTok. And so you just have to be flexible and open to how they want to share information. But the reality is, I just encourage you to lead with what you are for and what you believe in.
Thank you. As you can tell, we are passionate about this. We could talk about it all day. We won't necessarily go into the suggestions, or we could maybe see if that can somehow be entailed in the questions that you might have, but we do want to leave just a moment in case there are questions, comments, or concerns that you'd like to share with us.